Hello, I'm Ads, and today I'm excited to show you how I painted my Leviathan Parasite of Mortrex. So we've seen Necrons on the channel so far, but I am stoked to be painting this mini. Tyranids were my introduction to miniatures when I was 15 or 16, and they're still my absolute first love in the game. I'm looking to get my army back up and running properly as soon as I've whittled down my massive Necron backlog, but I couldn't pass up on the Parasite's release. As a quick aside, I struggled to find army painter equivalents to some of the paints I used in this video. I picked the best ones to my eye, but you should check the colour before committing to using them or picking the colours up, or even in the case of the purples here, resort to mixing. I tried, sorry. I sprayed my Parasite with a base coat of Wraithbone spray primer first. Cream is the majority of the colour scheme on this thing, so having Wraithbone spray is a godsend. It's a pain to get smooth in northwest England's weather, but I used a brush to cover anywhere the spray didn't hit well. I also left the arms off the mini to make painting a little easier on myself. The cream skin recipe I use is pretty much Juan Hidalgo's method, so be sure to check out his Leviathan Termagant video, I'll link it in the top right. I start by washing the skin with a 2-to-1 mix of Majus Purple and Contrast Medium, pushing it into the joints and between the separations of the skin. The only areas I'm avoiding are the splits in the forearms, I'm wanting to make those much pinker. I'm left with a very sore looking Parasite, so I clean up with a relayer of Screaming Skull. Where the skin dips in around the joints or separations, I'm thinning this down to try and maintain a gradient, but on the flatter areas I'm just using my usual relayering consistency. I now bring in Pallid Witch Flesh as a highlight. I'm focusing on areas that catch casting light from above, so mostly just upper facing areas. Where it's needed, I'm also watering this down to a glaze and pulling a circular highlight to round areas like the upper arms. Lastly, with this being a character, I'm doing one last smaller highlight with white ink. I'd probably not do this step on rank and file bugs, but the Parasite deserves this extra step. I next look to the wings of the Parasite, and I want a leathery skin look to these. I start with an all-over base coat of Bogman's Glow, being as careful as I can not to overspill onto the cream skin where I can. Some areas can be tricky to reach if you've glued the wings on like I have, so take your time and focus on where you're placing your brush. If you do make a mistake, not to worry, I'll show you how to fix that later as there's a couple more messy steps first. I realised I'm going to be using the same highlight colour on the open splits in the cream skin while painting in the wings, so I quickly run a 2-to-1 mix of Volupus Pink and Contrast Medium into these. I hit any areas of exposed internal flesh, I suppose, that I can see. So the small splits at the top of the lower legs, the joints, the inside of the tail, and her mouth, neck, and inside of the mandibles. I also faded out a coat of this on the ridge detail and the big segmenty bits at the end of her tail. Next I use Cadian Flashtone in a couple different applications. I first use it as a dry brush along the centre of each wing membrane. This seems a little counterintuitive as dry brushing is used to catch raised details and there aren't many in here. However, a circular motion and a few passes from top to bottom of each section will eventually build in a nice faded transition in each one. I then thin down the flesh tone to a glaze and try to smooth out the chalky edge of the dry brush, pulling the brush from the outside of each membrane to the centre. I also highlight a couple of moulded stretches with it. This point is a good time to clean up the skin areas, as dry brushing is a messy practice and I certainly have overbrushed across the skin here. All I do is bring back Screaming Skull, Pallid Witch Flesh and White and just relayer and re-highlight anywhere I've got the skin tone over. It's a hard call on whether to paint the wings or skin in first because of how I do this, so if you feel like you'd make an absolute state to the skin with dry brushing, consider painting the wings in first and then fixing up the Wraithbone base layer and doing the skin afterwards. So the wings look lovely here, so you can leave them if you want, but I wanted a ridged, almost ripped skin look to them. To do that, I take Kislev flesh and water it down heavily, more so than a usual highlight consistency, but not a glaze. I want this very thin. I then go membrane by membrane and paint in lines passing from one side to the other. I don't have any particular thought process here, and I'm doing this for the second time in the recording here, so I'm totally winging it, but I'm at least trying to build up a bigger concentration of colour across the Cadian flesh tone areas and leaving the darker sides mostly alone. While I have this colour, I also highlight the areas I washed with Volupus pink earlier. The joint and skin splits have moulded details that could do with a highlight, and I want it fleshy looking, so I took a quick pass of those now. Next I do the same line painting process, but with flayed one flesh. I try my best to follow the lines I drew in earlier, and aim to paint in a smaller area than before, leaving some of the Kislev flesh showing. I go once more after that with Pallid Witch Flesh, treating this as a highlight down the middle, and finally a couple dots of white ink. Whilst you have your white, do the same on the Volupus pink sections too, a small dot highlight to finish them off. To finish the effect on the wings, I take Reikland Flesh Shade, water it down to a more glaze-like consistency, and wash the outer dark edges of the membranes. The idea is to smooth out the transition a little more with a kind of filter over those layers, as well as darken down the extreme edges a touch more for better separation. I also use this thinner shade to emphasize some of the separations in the painted splits, just to mix up the depth of them a little bit. Midway through painting the wings, I decided I wanted to bring the cream skin colour onto the back of the wings, something along the lines of pictures of flying foxes I've seen where the back of the wings are the same black as their body colour. I did this by bringing back Screaming Skull and mixing it about 1 to 3 with Larmian Medium, then painting the colour from about halfway up the wing. I concentrate my time toward the top of the membranes first and feather out the paint when I get near where I want the fade to happen. I do this by quickly washing out my brush, wiping off the excess water, then running small circles along the line to fade the paint out along the gradient. I did this quite a few times, in places something like 7 or 8 times because of how transparent Screaming Skull is, but eventually I have a solid cream colour that fades to the skin texture I built in. I'll do the same with Pallid Witch Flesh, needing less coats this time as I did the groundwork with the Screaming Skull first. And finally with white ink, I add some edge highlights around the membranes, both on the moulded stretches and placing some in a similar way to the flesh tones earlier. I'll also add some dots of white along the fade line to add some speckles for a bit more interest. These wings were a lot more work than I'd anticipated, but they look stellar to me. Really proud of how they've turned out. Now onto the purple Carapace, the fun part. I do a similar trick that I use for the dark green on my Necrons here, starting with an all-over base coat of matte black. I thin this down quite a way to an almost ink-like consistency to try and avoid blocking up any details. Then I bring in Nagaroth Knight, and I'll be using this 2 different ways. Firstly, I'm doing a long gradient across each section of the Carapace with a glaze. I want the back to be pure black and a faint purple towards the edges. Secondly, I'll be running a thick edge highlight to each plate with it, as well as drawing in lines to mimic the striation effects you always see done on Tyranid Carapaces. Next I use Xerius Purple, running the same edge highlight as with the Nagaroth Knight, only thinner this time. I'll also water this down a little further and draw in more lines toward the edges of the plates, only thinner where I can. I then do the same with Genestealer Purple, thinner again where I can and drawing fewer lines on the Carapace. And lastly, Slaanesh Grey as a point highlight for the final few lines. The end result is a nice faux purple with a look of built up striations. Typically, I can't settle for the standard colour scheme and decided I wanted coloured markings on the Carapace. This is completely optional, it's just something I thought would look cool. I do a bit of research beforehand on beetle and insect patterns to see what I want to do, and settled on something like a fiddler beetle patterning. I drew this over a picture in Photoshop to get an idea first, then bit the bullet, grabbed Jacaro orange and drew in the shapes of the pattern. You have to be brave on this, you can always touch up or take the paint off if you mess up. My paint is thinner than usual to allow easy application, and I draw the general shape of each mark before thickening it out with more paint. No need for perfection or symmetry, beetle carapaces weren't crafted so aren't identical on both sides. Once I'm happy with the Jacaro segments, I use Troll Slayer Orange as a relayer to brighten it up. Once that's dry, I shade toward the back half and up under each plate with Fugan Orange, just along the patterns where I can. Washes are a little awkward to be precise with, but a thin layer like I'm using here won't show up on the black base coat, not to worry about overspill. I then highlighted just the hard ridge down any centre lines with Fire Dragon Bright, then Lugganath Orange. I then bring in a glaze of Aerial Yellow towards the front half of the patterns. I do the same with Flash Gits Yellow, then redraw the striation lines and edge highlight with Moon Dust. A final point highlight of Pallid Witch Flesh tops the patterns off. It's a lot more work, but I like that my little splinter of Leviathan has its own look to differentiate it now. I'll take on the red details next, which with the Parasite is only her claws and her tail. I base coat all of these areas with corn red first, being careful not to overbrush around the skin. I then give these an all-over coat with a 50-50 mix of Black Templar and Contrast Medium. I'm more comfortable doing the claws like this as they're a smaller area. You could feasibly do this with the Carapace, but the larger surface area will make the black look more splodgy. I introduce the contrast to the pointiest part of the claw and draw the brush back, trying to have the paint collect towards the back more so than the front. This will help out with the gradient I want to add in along these areas. I then reintroduce corn red as a glaze. Wanting the pointy ends are brighter red than up near the back, I pull the paint in the opposite direction to how I put on the contrast before. I then edge highlight the claws with Evil Sun's Scarlet, as well as adding another glazed layer to the gradient just to make it a touch brighter. I finish them with an edge highlight of Wild Rider Red, a thinner highlight of Fire Dragon Bright, and because she's a very special girl, I'll also do a point highlight with Lugganath Orange. I wouldn't do this with the smaller Gribblies, this is just for characters and big bugs. And lastly are the teeth and smaller spikes on the inside of the tail, which I base with Rakarth Flesh and then wash over with Agrax Earthshade. I relayer these up with Rakarth Flesh again to re-establish it as a mid-tone, painting in lines where I can to look like gnarly teeth growing all over the place. These then get one more highlight of Pallid Witch Flesh, painted as a line down the centre and one on either side. The last drop of white ink at the very tip gives them the sharp look that I want. So the miniature's done at this point, bar the base. However, since this is a Tyranid, I just wanted to show the age-old stringy saliva trick. She's hungry for Space Marine buffet, so I want to illustrate that on the model. If you haven't seen this before, I use Yoo-Hoo glue and a cocktail stick to pull some clear, stringy slobber across the jaw. You can pair this with a gloss varnish to mimic spit dribbling down the neck, or even mix in some blood for the blood god to get a more gory look to her. Mixing paint in makes the glue dry super fast in my experience, so run a small practice sample before you go for it just to know the limits of the material. And with the base textured, painted and rimmed, and a more all slobbery, the Parasite of Mortrex is complete. This was an absolute joy to paint, it's so good to get my hands on a Tyranid again, and one that's so new no less. If you have any questions or I skipped over something too quickly, feel free to leave a comment below and I'll get back to you. Thanks again for watching, good luck with your Parasite, I'll see you again soon.